Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new lunch lecture. Thank you for being here today. I am Sabri Reynolds. I will be hosting today's lunch lecture about the compatibility of today's internet with democracy. I'm really happy to welcome Professor Stefan Lewandowski, whom I will introduce in a minute. But first, let's talk about EDMO and the lunch lectures. So EDMO, as you know, is the European Digital Media Observatory, which brings together fact-checkers, journalists, experts, media literacy experts, and academic researchers to tackle, fight, or understand better disinformation. And within EDMO, EDMO BELUX is the hub that focuses on Belgium and Luxembourg. And within that context, we organize lunch lectures, which is a series of webinars that are aimed at understanding better information and related topics. So today we will listen to Professor Lewandowski. He is a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol, whose research centers on the tension between online architectures and democracy. He has heavily published on the issue of disinformation, and he is one of the lead joint authors of the report recently published by the JSA, the European Commission Science and Knowledge Service, on democracy and information. And what we will present today rests partly on this material. So today we'll review the evidence we have to support the assertion that the internet in its current form is antithetical to democracy. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long and will be followed by a discussion. So feel free to react and ask questions in the dedicated space in the chat, and I will use these comments to feed the discussion. So Stefan, thank you again for being here, and I'll let you start your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Yes, you should be able to see my slides. Is that correct? I'm sharing
Yes.
them. Okay,
yes.
Very good. So I'll move on and give you a little bit of context first. I'm old enough to remember when history was supposed to end in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War was over, democracy spread around the world. There was a liberal consensus, at least among Western nations, and the future seemed pretty okay. Well, didn't quite turn out that way, and we're now living in a period of intense democratic backsliding. What you can see here are data from the latest VDEM report, a very thorough analysis of the state of democracy around the world. As you can see, for the EU and other countries kind of like the EU, including Canada, for example, there's a bit of a decline of democracy over the last 10 years or so, but it is nothing like what has been experienced by the United States, where the drop is precipitous, and this graph is outdated. I think things are now even worse. So the question is, who's to blame for this? Now, obviously, that doesn't have a simple answer. I don't want to pretend there is a single culprit that can be identified, but quite a few influential commentators have blamed social media for quite some time about the decline in democracy. Here's Shoshana Zuboff, who is very vocal about this, but she's not the only one. There are other scholars that have raised concern about democracy in the internet about 10 years ago. And now we have an updated concern building on this earlier work about AI, which is a new player on the stage. And we now have the same concern about AI. Now, first of all, as I already said, there's no easy or binary answer to this. You can't say, oh, yes, it's the internet. Oh, yes, it's AI. I think we're never going to have a simple answer like that. However, there are aspects of social media that are detrimental to democracy. And it turns out that some of those aspects are difficult to change because they're actually arising out of the quintessential essence of what social media is about. And moreover, classic countermeasures are not always effective. And those are the points I want to make by a fairly selective review of the evidence over the next 20 minutes or so. Now, I want to focus on three aspects of social media: network effects, the attention economy, and algorithmic amplification. Now, chances are you're all familiar with this. If you work in this arena, I would assume that. But nonetheless, I think it's worth fleshing out why exactly each of these attributes of social media has an impact potentially on democracy. So let's talk about network effects, or the consequences of homophily, which is the tendency of people to hook up with others who are like them online. Now, that's basically what social media is about. You go online, you go on Facebook, you find friends. Now, the friends are going to be like you, otherwise they'd be less likely to be friends. We call that homophily, but it has consequences that most people underestimate and don't consider. Now, here's one example, completely arbitrary example, but it's very common. Let me explain what's going on here. We have this big purple guy in the middle. Let's call him Fred. And Fred went online and he hooked up with friends, virtual friends, and he's connected to them through those solid lines. Now, what you will find is that most of the friends are like him. They're purple. Now, purple could be anything. In this case, let's just assume it's some political opinion that is purple. There's another one that's yellow, but Fred prefers purple because 4 out of his 6 friends are also purple. Now, for Fred, that means, oh, okay, most people are purple, just like me. That's his perception. But if you count the total number of connections and total number of people in this network, then you find that the reality is actually the other way around. Yellow is globally the predominant opinion, and purple is in a minority. But Fred doesn't know that. Now, that is almost an inevitable outcome of homophily, that is, that you hook up with friends online. And that has consequences, psychological consequences that are well understood. The first consequence is that if I'm surrounded by people who are like me and who share my opinion, then I become entrenched in that belief because I feel everybody else believes that. Why should I change my mind? That is a very common phenomenon. It's well understood. And in the case of social media, it implies that a tiny group of people can become entrenched in pretty much any belief. Because no matter how absurd my belief is, I can go on Facebook and find people like that. I can find people who think the earth is flat. In the real world, I can't do that because there's so few of them, I'd never find them. But online, bang, they're one mouse click away. Now, one other consequence of this is that if I have a fringe belief that I mistakenly think is widely shared, then I will wonder, now, wait a minute, why are these remote politicians, why isn't the elite listening to us? We're the people who know the answer. The earth is flat. Everybody knows that. Why don't the politicians do that? And so by having this false consensus effect, this perception of other people thinking like us, that is sufficient to then also become disenchanted with the elites, and hence to resort to populist attitudes. How do I know that? Well, there was a recent study I thought was fantastic, done on a very large sample of people in Germany, published last year, where they looked at a number of hot button issues, asked people's opinions about these hot button issues, because they knew what people overall thought, and also asked people how much they thought their belief was shared. They were able to identify the portion of beliefs that were based on a false consensus. And this is plotted along the x-axis here. Now, on the y-axis, they're plotting populist attitudes, such as an item, the people, not politicians, should make important decisions, and so on, a whole number of items tapping into populist sentiments. And what you can see is that there's a very strong relationship between the number of false consensus beliefs and endorsement of populism. And the mechanism is that, if you're in a small minority but think that's the majority view, then the politicians, who of course will not do your thing, they shouldn't, because they should go with the majority, well, they will appear remote and disconnected and ignoring you. This is the same data, again, cleaned up, so you get the strength of the effect and the distribution of false consensus beliefs. And the problem is that this is something that is arising from the core function of social media, namely to connect people. That is what makes this so difficult to deal with, because we want people to be connected. Well, yeah, except it has the flow-on consequences that they lose calibration of how much their opinion is shared by others. And this can breed the political alienation that we're currently observing in many countries around the world. And that is detrimental to democracy if it expresses itself as support for extreme right populist views. And to me, that is something that emerges straight out of the architecture of the internet. Well, I can talk about possible solutions later, but it's a non-trivial problem to solve. All right, that's the first one. Second one, the attention economy. Well, everybody knows what that is. It means that the main product online is your attention. As a general rule of thumb, if anything is free online, then you're being sold. That is your attention, your personal data is the merchandise that others are making money with. And there's some key factors that we have to understand from cognitive research to interpret this. The first one is that we know human attention is captured by novelty and by negative emotion. Now, whether we like it or not, we're more likely to look at a terrible scene of an accident than a lovely meadow in the Alps. I mean, we may want to be lovely, but the reality is that our attention is captured by negative information. And that means that the attributes of disinformation and political extremism, which is to be outrage-provoking and to be novel, are the very features that are maximizing platform profits. So the very structure of the attention economy is incentivizing poor quality information. Facebook is a machine designed to drench society in outrage, basically. Now, they didn't mean to do that, but the reality is that that is precisely what it is. And that's very difficult to fix, because there's a fundamental misalignment in the attention economy. What do I mean by that? This is based on work by Plunkett. Well, in traditional markets, the producers and consumers share a common interest, namely to satisfy consumer preferences. I buy a toaster or whatever, a lipstick, anything, and I want that to fulfill my needs. I want the toaster to toast my bread. If it doesn't do that, then eventually the producer is going to take notice, because no one's going to buy the toaster. So there is a feedback signal, however imperfect, between the consumer and the producer. Now, that's one important thing of traditional markets. The second important thing of traditional markets is that pollution externalities are coincidental to the transaction. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that, Exxon, Mr. Exxon or whatever, doesn't get up in the morning saying, oh, great, I'm going to pump out CO2 emissions and make climate change worse. That's not their goal. Yeah, of course they're doing it by selling fossil fuels, but it's external to their commercial transaction. It's not something they intend to do. Now look at the attention economy. Things are different there, because there the commercial transaction is not involving you, the user. It's involving advertisers and the platform. So the feedback signal does not involve you, the consumer. If there's any feedback at all, it's between the platform and the advertisers. And so they're going to work together to maximize engagement. That is to keep you on the platform so they can maximize profit. But in so doing, the way they keep you on the platform is by polluting it with misinformation and outrage. So the externalities that are incidental to the fossil fuel industry, they're actually precisely the point of a social media platform, because you are not involved in the transaction, and whatever externality there is that makes your life worse by being drenched in outrage, well, that's how they make their money. And that is something that, without changing the business model, is extremely difficult to change. Now, the third point, asymmetric algorithmic amplification. Well, we all know that algorithms are curating people's news feeds on Facebook or X. But what does that actually mean? Well, we do know a little bit about what it means, increasingly so. Here's one example taken from the German election last year, where the researchers analyzed the number of tweets that were posted by politicians during the election campaign, broken down by party, and the proportion of tweets from that party that show up in the default feed of users. So let's first look at the yellowish bars. That is the proportion of tweets by politicians from different parties that are aligned, by the way, from extreme left to extreme right. I will focus on two. The one sort of in the center, the Green Party, which was in government at the time leading up to the election, which posted about a quarter of all tweets. And the extreme right, the AfD, which only posted 15% of the tweets. So in fact, the Green Party was tweeting more than the AfD. Users would have never seen that or known that, because in the feed, the red bars, what you find is that the AfD content more than doubled, and the Green Party content was suppressed by 8%. So the impression that a user gets is of nearly 10 times as much extreme right content than green content. And that discrepancy is the work of the algorithm. And this isn't just one study. We have that similar result for TikTok. We can show this over and over again, and we can even show that things changed after Elon Musk acquired Twitter. Here is one study that came out last year looking at the market share of low quality information before and after Musk acquired Twitter. And as you can see in both panels, they're using different measures to express the same thing. There was a rapid increase, a considerable increase in the content that was low quality and a decline of content that was high in quality that coincided exactly with the takeover of X by Musk, suggesting that, platform ownership, not surprising, makes a huge difference. And is, again, something that society is really not prepared for to deal with. And here is a similar study showing that for climate change and COVID, two crucial issues, low quality content that is not in line with the scientific information is favored on X through the algorithm. It's not the posting itself, it is the up-ranking of the algorithm. So that's the third point. Now, what do we do about it? What are the countermeasures here? Well, there are three levels, at least, in my analysis of countermeasures. We can do something with individuals, we can redesign the system, or we can regulate the online space. Let me briefly present some snippets of each, beginning with individualized responses. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the emphasis on somehow making people smarter or helping people or telling people stuff, but leaving it up to the individual to deal with the issue at hand. One example is the emphasis on transparency by providers that is now mandated in the EU as part of the AI Act. Article 50 here is basically saying, well, unless it's obvious from the context, because you're on ChatGPT, you have to tell people if AI content or if content is AI generated. Okay, so transparency is supposed to inform users so they can then decide what to do with the information. That seems important, given that we live in an age where information can be generated by AI that's indistinguishable for the most part, or increasingly so, from real videos and audio. And that can make a big difference in politics. I mean, this really happened a few, not that long ago, that the mayor of London was confronted with a fake audio of him saying things he never did. So how do you cope with that? And how might transparency deal with that issue? Well, it just so happens that a PhD student of mine and I published a paper on this earlier this year. And we started from the assumption that if I show you a deepfake video and I tell you it's a deepfake, then you should dismiss it because it has no probative value. It shouldn't influence you. It's made up, right? Here's a video. Hello, it's fake. Nothing in here is real. Well, then you shouldn't be influenced by it normatively, rationally. I mean, that is what people should do. Now, we ran a study in which we put that to the test. So we presented videos that were either real or fake. And we either mentioned nothing to people or we warned them, sometimes very specifically, that a video was fake. And they ran 3 experiments. In all cases, we showed a deepfake video. Well, sometimes it was fake, sometimes it was real. And it was always of a person confessing to some transgression. And the task of participants was to identify, in their judgment, how guilty that person was. So, for example, my favorite one is a video where a vegan influencer confessed to eating a hamburger at an airport. And that was a big thing. She was very emotional about the apology. And you can see 2 snapshots there. One is the real actor. The other one is a fake produced from the actor being modeled by AI. And we asked people how guilty the person was in the video. Now, here's data from the first experiment. In the control condition, there was no information given about guilt or otherwise. And people say, yeah, okay, well, probably not guilty. Okay? Because, in fact, they came very close to the midline, which means impossible to say. So they basically were doing the right thing. Now, the bar on the right is the same data from the same people, the same randomized group of people. And they thought the person in the video was guilty, even though we specifically told them, hey, this is fake. Nothing here is real, okay? We were pretty explicit in how far we went to tell people that this is fake. And people didn't ignore it. They were swayed by it. So the moment you provide information, people will accept it, will rely on it, even if they know ahead of time that it is fake. And here's the second experiment. And we had a third experiment. Of course, I'm not going to show you all the data. But basically, what you can see is that in all cases, the crucial dark bars, you have judgments that are above the midline. That means guilty. The vegan influencer who doesn't exist was guilty of eating a hamburger, even though we told people that it was all made up. So now it does reduce the rating of guilt a little bit compared to when there's no warning, but it's only partially effective. This isn't the only demonstration. We know from a lot of other research that people continue to rely on information they should recognize as having no probative value, and yet they do use it. That's well known, well established, and transparency is not the solution to that problem. So that's just one snippet of a lot of work showing that, in my opinion, that yes, you can do good things to individuals by training them, teaching them, telling them stuff, correcting them, whatever, but it's never fully effective. It is usually only partially effective, if that. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to redesign the system. The alternative is to design social media for democracy, not against democracy. How might one do that? Well, here's one recent study where the researchers designed a browser plugin that took over people's feed on X, and that interfered with the algorithm. It was either up-ranking or down-ranking anti-democratic content. So there were two conditions: either increasing the exposure or decreasing the exposure to anti-democratic content, and comparing that in each case with a control condition in which the original X algorithm was maintained. Now, what effect did this have on people's emotions and their feelings about the outgroup, members of the other party? This was done in the United States. And here is the answer: that increasing exposure to anti-democratic content makes people more hostile towards the outgroup, both during the experiment and afterwards. And this ran for a whole week. So the afterwards means there was a lasting carryover. By contrast, reducing the exposure made people feel less hostile towards the outgroup in comparison to the standard X algorithm. Now, that tells us that the standard X algorithm, even though it's not quite as bad as highlighting anti-democratic content, it is not good enough because it is still permitting considerable exposure to anti-democratic content. And similarly, we get changes in self-reported emotions. Anger, sadness goes up with anti-democratic content. It goes down if you remove that content, again, in comparison to the X algorithm. So there is opportunity here to make the feed more compatible with democracy than it currently is. How might you do that? Well, oh, this should be 3, not 2. My apologies. How do you do that? Well, you regulate. Because the platforms, I can guarantee you, have no intrinsic motivation to fix the problem, because it's making them money, and they would lose money, or they would fear that they're losing money by changing the algorithm. And the EU is, working on that. They've now put out quite a bit of legislation. Most of it is aimed at empowering users. The DSA is actually empowering users. It gets lost very often in the public debate, such as it is, but it is, in my opinion, a step in the right direction. Now, the major problem with this is that under the current regime in the United States, which is working hand in glove with the platforms, these efforts have been reframed as censorship. Now, they aren't. Let me be very clear on that. They're not. But nonetheless, politically, it's very effective to create this chimerical threat of censorship. And to me, that underscores one of the most critical regulatory responses, which is that the EU needs digital autonomy. That means it cannot be reliant on foreign-owned and foreign-controlled platforms who have to comply with European legislation technically, but who do so only with reluctance and to the least extent possible, and constantly on search for loopholes, and while at the same time politically trying to undermine that effort. You're not going to fix that with the current business model and ownership system. You need to replace everything with EU-owned and controlled platforms. There's a lot of reasons for this, including the US government's ability to mandate what the platforms do, regardless of local legislation. There's American legislation that American controlled companies have to comply with that overrides whatever you may want. You know, the DSA, the GDPR, none of that all goes out the window. It's no protection whatsoever the moment an American platform is involved, be it software or hardware. There's no question that that is so. If you doubt me, read the Cloud Act, an act of Congress that makes that extremely clear, and that we have seen in action in many recent instances. But to me, that is absolutely crucial. And good, we have plenty of time for questions. This is sort of my last slide. I want to draw your attention to a report that I co-led for the European Commission that came out about 2 months ago. Here's the QR code, and in which we review pretty much everything I just told you in far greater detail, but also in which we outline solutions, possible solutions at far more detail than is possible here, including a whole chapter on the need for digital autonomy. Now, the good news on this is that very few people now disagree with that. I think there has been a seismic shift in understanding within the European Commission and elsewhere that we need sovereignty. It has become a strategic goal. And yeah, now all we got to do is do it. And that's, I guess, the hard part. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And great, we have more than 20 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for this really interesting presentation. If someone wants to react or ask questions, don't hesitate to use the dedicated space in the chat. I have a few reactions and questions, of course. Yeah, it's true that now maybe the actors in the European institution, for example, the European Commission, they are more aware of the necessity to have digital autonomy, but at the same time, it looks like the current pressure of the US make them maybe like slow down on the regulatory approach, for example, when we see like the last steps of this question. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I know. That fear is certainly in the room and on the table, and justifiably so, given the American threats vis-a-vis the EU. You know, like to pull out of NATO if the TSA is being enforced and all that. Now, look, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you what's going to happen. But my impression is that those threats are not currently finding much traction for several reasons. The main reason being that I think Europe is realizing that the Americans don't give a damn about NATO anyhow. It doesn't matter what the Europeans do. And the increasing realization that appeasement gets you nowhere, combined with the experience that even without US support, the Ukraine is doing very well. Thank you very much. And I think likewise, there's an increasing perception that I have of self-confidence on the part of Europeans, which I think is long overdue. Europe can do this. You know, we're the largest market in the world, bigger than the US. And you know, the only thing we don't have is the political ruthlessness to convert that into power. But I think we're actually heading in that direction. I'm cautiously optimistic that enforcement of the TSA is not going to stop. Musk is being fined, and he paid his fine. He first said, no, I'm not going to comply. This is censorship, blah, blah. Yeah, well, no, he did pay. And he also paid the fine in Brazil. And, you know, they try to pretend that they're more powerful than national governments, and that's clearly their agenda. They're quite open about it. if you know where to look. But in reality, they're not there yet. And so I don't know. The glass is kind of it's not empty. It may not be half full, but there's plenty in it to for me to be vaguely optimistic that the EU will move in the right direction.
Yeah, and it makes me think of when you say that still about regulation, platforms have a fear of losing money. Uh, Is it still true? It seems like it's kind of true right now, but with the more power they have, I guess they will have like less fear of losing money. Maybe it's not the main attention, or depending also on the fact that the Europe is not maybe the main market currently. Maybe it can
Well,
not have that effect.
I wonder about Europe not being their main market. I mean, it's extremely difficult to find out, of course, because a lot of this stuff is hidden and camouflaged and buried and I mean the social media platforms are sort of like the fossil fuel companies on steroids when vis-a-vis climate change. If you think fossil fuel and climate change is a problem, well, I think social media and democracy is a far bigger problem, far more. The antagonism there is almost greater. It's hard to imagine, but I worked in both arenas and I know how these guys operate. And Europe is very important to them, and they will ultimately comply when they have to. I don't think that's enough. I think we need real competition. We need European platforms that operate according to different principles. And I mean, it's not rocket science. This problem is solvable, and we know it's solvable because the platforms did it. In the lead up to the 2020 election, for example, Facebook reduced misinformation content by 80%. They know exactly what's happening on their platforms. It is simply a political choice. They make more money if they keep all that anti-democratic rubbish out there, and they curry favor with the Trump regime if they keep it out there. But, if they wanted to, they could turn it off tomorrow. We know that. And that is what's so, important not to lose track of, that we have the technological solutions. YouTube knows exactly where the misinformation is coming from. For example, I know that for a fact because they told me. And why don't they turn it off? Well, because politically they're scared, because most of the stuff is right-wing material. And also they make money from it. And that's as simple as that. The only way you can change that is by forcing them to do it differently. And that means regulation or competition. I think European competition in this space would make a huge difference.
And we talked a lot about these regulation aspects, and going back to the different elements that's part maybe of this losing of democracy on internet. The first one, the network effects. It's kind of something that is not directly related to the fact that it's based on social media that are owned by private actors. And so how do we find ways of changing that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. The homophily and the network effects arise not from a specific business model, but from the quintessential nature of social media. It is the price you pay for having the good stuff, which is that people can connect. And so, no, I'm not blaming the platforms for that. Well, the only countermeasure, frankly, that I can think of at the moment is to help people get calibrated in the prevalence of their own opinions. If I'm a flat earther and I get a whatever, some statistic every time I go on my news group, it says only 1 in 100,000 people think like you. Okay. Keep that in mind. You can do whatever you want, but just keep in mind you're 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million or whatever. And that's easy enough to ascertain. The prevalence of those opinions. You can do that by linguistic analysis. I mean, the platforms can do this. Trust me, they have a lot of capability. So they could provide a calibration signal. And then if people know that they're in a sort of tiny minority, well, at least they know that. They can, of course, ignore it, but it makes it a little harder for them to say, oh, well, the politicians are out of touch because they don't believe me that the earth is flat. Well, maybe they do the smart thing, which is to go with the majority of, the 999,000 out of 100,000 people who do accept that the earth is round. So that's the one thing I can see there as a possibility. There may be other things, but frankly, I haven't thought about it beyond the calibration.
Yeah, and it makes me think of the study you presented about how the people, even if they know that the content is fake, like the deep fakes videos you
Yes.
showed, they still choose, I won't say choose, but they still believe in these things and change the mind. So it's something that happened there. Maybe it's something, so in that situation, if they believe in disinformation, even if they know that there is disinformation, the fact that we will tell them that there are 1 in a million, will it change something? It's not
Well,
sure, right?
no, I agree.
Right.
I agree. It's far from guaranteed that this would make a difference. My own work suggests that it might not. That's true. Yes, I'm well aware of that. Unfortunately, in this instance, I don't know what else to say unless to prevent people from creating homophilic clusters. Now, there's one other thing you can do, and actually, I had a colleague here at Bristol years ago who used to work on this, and that is to inject content into those groups from the outside, authentic content that is trying to inject a little more breadth into their discussion without telling them, oh, you shouldn't think that, and without, whatever. You take all the precautions necessary. And if people are, if you hit the sweet spot of content that's sympathetic overall, but nonetheless is kind of saying, hey guys, you're a bit off here, then you can de-radicalize people that way. The algorithms exist to do that. So that's another place we can turn to. It has, of course, other problems, which is, recruiting the content and justifying why it's there. But, it's just an algorithmic intervention, which is no different from what is happening now on Facebook. It's if you accept algorithm, then you can also accept algorithms that are working for democracy.
Yeah, and maybe it will change over time. There is a comment and a question in the chat saying that regardless the label, the message still come through with confirmation bias, echo chamber, etc. And not mentioning the risk that in the next years there will be reduced interest in whether something is AI made or real, with effect on trust, of course. So the question is, do you think we will pay a generational price, and that in a couple of decades, average citizens will be knowledge and cognitively equipped to deal with all of this?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So I think, well, okay, first of all, in general, I think trying to get rid of AI is not going to happen. Trying to get rid of social media, forget it. It's not going to happen. Those things are here to stay. So we have to learn how to cope with both. And I think ultimately it is quite possible that we will. The problems are solvable in both cases. That's not guaranteed to happen, by the way. I think techno-fascism is a real option for our future, and one that is uncomfortably close. But we're not there yet. And there are alternative models to this. Now, whatever we do, part of the response has to be to educate a whole new generation of users who learn from early on how to cope with this thing. For example, AI. It's to me, AI is a wonderful tool. I'm confessing that I use it all day, in many different ways. And I find it extremely useful. But I can also see how, for students, first-year students who don't know what they're doing, the temptation to ask it to write an essay is overpowering. Oh, I don't have to do this. I can just tell it, do this for me, and there it is. It's brilliant. Holy cow! If it's a very hard thing for somebody to overcome that. But I think we can do it. We have to do it through teaching. It just has to be put into the teaching. Yeah, go and write an essay with ChatGPT, and let's then talk about how that differs from what you could have done, and how much more you could have learned if you'd done it differently. And I think we have to just develop those skills as a society, and we can. If we're given the time, and if it is not politically prevented. Does that answer your question?
I think it is. And there is another question about maybe this aspect, like we should teach kids and young people several elements related to this aspect, and regarding, for example, the dangers of the algorithms and platform business model, which aspect, according to you, would be the most important to talk about with kids and young people?
Well, I think just teaching them how the algorithm works and how it favors outrage evoking information would be a really good thing to do. And, you can even simulate this in a classroom. Everybody produces something, and then the teacher shows it all and says, okay, let's see what an algorithm would do. And then the algorithm goes through and picks all the bad stuff, and then it's a hands-on demonstration. And all the people who wrote good stuff, they sit there thinking, whoa, why is my stuff invisible? Right? So I think you can have some very good, I could envisage this being done to considerable success in schools. I was in Berlin a few months ago, a year ago, whatever, and for a workshop with teachers in Germany, high school teachers who are doing basically that. They're teaching about algorithms and social media. They get the students to listen to influencer videos on YouTube, which for me was an amazing experience because I don't have time usually to do this and wouldn't know where to go. But so I had a chance to, and it's amazingly informative to see what's out there, and also how you can use it as a teaching method. So I think we can do it, but you got to redesign the syllabus from the ground up. You got to start this in primary school, year 1 or whatever, because kids now are awash in online content. This idea that you can keep them off online content until they're 16 is a little bit probably naive. All these bans that are going on in Australia and so on. I mean, yeah, don't know. I'm not a great fan, although I think something had to be done. But whether this was the best thing, I remain to be convinced. Let's put it that way. But I'll wait for data on that. What I think is more powerful is to programmatically, an hour a day, teach children in school how to use digital tools. And I think that in the long run is something we have to do anyway.
And someone is mentioning the climate change aspects. If there is more awareness about the extreme environmental impact of AI, maybe it could lead to not only for kids and young people, but to a more rational use of AI. Would it be possible?
Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, very good question. And Honestly, I have no idea. I think there's a huge backlash against AI in addition to enthusiasm at the moment, especially in academia. I mean, I have some colleagues who are, you know, very opposed to AI and very public about it on social media. And so they, of course, use the energy, the climate change argument and the water issue and all that. And yeah, that's certainly part of it. Whether that'll make a difference by itself, I don't know. I also don't know, honestly, to what extent that's going to be a long-term problem because I suspect they will soon develop more distributed computing of those models where you download a lot of the computation onto your own laptop, which is running anyway, so it might as well do the computation to the extent that it can. And so I'm not that worries me temporarily, but I think in the long run, I doubt very much that we're going to go down this mega data center, nuclear power plant sort of territory. It sounds inefficient, and I think somebody is going to figure out how to distribute the computation. That's my best guess.
And going back to the EU market and this competition maybe between social networks for maybe a better social networks that would appear, there is a question about it. So do you think the EU in more than 20 years since we started to use these platforms broadly have not yet tried to create publicly funded European platforms in the same way we did at the national level, for example, with newspapers and television, with public services media? In that line, if we created such platforms, do you have in mind any profound reformulation of the social media model that we could apply? Because we have already several models that from the private sector, and maybe it will be hard to think of another kind of model.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, the reason Europe doesn't have it is because it never occurred to us that it was necessary. And in a world of, where most actors are law-abiding and are not trying to disrupt and destroy, that model worked fine. Facebook was talking to the commission and the commission was regulating and Facebook was complying and this co-regulation model was all the rage and everybody was happy. I'm not saying it was good. I'm just saying it worked and there was very little impetus for us to worry about changing it. But of course the world has changed and now geopolitically it's imperative that we do. Now, what would that look like? Okay, very good question. And if you want the detailed answer, I can refer you to that report I just showed you the QR code for. We have a lot of stuff in there about solutions. Just briefly, I think what we don't have at the moment is interoperability and the opportunity for competition at the level of middleware. So, for example, at the moment, I'm either on Facebook or I'm not on Facebook. But I can't be on Facebook and then say, oh, I want a different algorithm. I want to get Mr. Smith's algorithm because that is supposed to be really good. Okay? Well, I can't do that. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be possible because there's so many different levels of what's a product here. You have the hardware with the cloud and everything. You have the general display software. You have the algorithm that could be very independent of everything else. And the list goes on. So I think in the long run, we have to break the monopolies in the same way that the railways were broken apart in the United States and that Bell Telephone was ripped apart in the 1970s in the US because it was a monopoly. And so we have to do a similar thing here. This is again not rocket science. It is simply how monopolies come to be, and then you have to break them to create market competition. And the process, that again, there's historical precedent. Every 50 years, something becomes too big, and the government breaks it down. Happened in the US several times. This is what we have to do. And once you understand that it's not really all that new and not really all that difficult, except politically, I think, again, we can do it. And the other biggest thing, of course, is the network effects, because the reason people are on Facebook is because everybody else is on Facebook, right? So you have to find a way to make that advantage go away. You have to allow people to take their users elsewhere. And with the AT protocol, the atmosphere protocol, that is possible on Blue Sky. Once you have, it's a little complicated, but once you have the right handle on Blue Sky, you can go to Eurosky, which is the European Blue Sky. Well, it's an AT protocol host. It's transparent to the users and followers and everybody else you're seeing, but you've moved your hosting into Europe, and I'm in the middle of doing that, by the way. So yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing that we have to develop: technology that allows interoperability, customizability, competition, at various different levels, and surrounding safeguarding regulation. It's entirely possible to have social media that are compatible with democracy if you know where to intervene. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of different business models that can be explored and that can be done. And yeah, lots of very exciting things, actually. It's actually a very exciting period of history because there's opportunities out there to make a huge difference by revising business models and algorithms in creative ways. And, the moment somebody pumps $1 billion in there or something and says, yeah, this is really great, it'll solve some of our problems.
Thank you. I have a last question, and then we will
Sure.
have to finish. So
Sure.
now, as we discussed, we are aware of these difficulties. We are aware of the fact that we have to have the EU sovereignty, for example. One small question, but we are mostly aware of that because of Donald Trump's second term and his ways of doing politics. So if it changes in the future with the next president, if there is one, and maybe with the midterm, maybe some people who agree to accept that this relation with the US and Europe can go back to the way it was and not changing this situation. Is it a possibility, like the way we didn't change the world after the COVID, for example, as we wanted to do?
Well, in my opinion, no. I'm with Mark Carney on this, the Prime Minister of Canada, who said this is a true rupture. I think it would be mad not to think of it as such, because the risks of pretending you can go back to what we had before is just continuing European dependence on the United States. We have to do whatever it takes to completely become independent. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be antagonistic. No, of course not. We can do business with them, but let's make sure the cloud is in Europe so the American government cannot grab our data or deny you email access, as they have done for the prosecutors at the International Criminal Court, for example, where Microsoft just turned off their email and their credit cards. Come on. No, we cannot take that risk. We have to be very strategic and just say, yeah, well, thank you guys, but it's been good, but from here on, we'll do it our way. And I think, what are the Americans going to do? I think ultimately they will just have to put up with that if Europe is strong enough. I mean, there's no appetite, I think, for them to, they talk about Greenland and Canada a lot and marching in there and occupying them, but in reality, I don't think they're quite well. They'll try it once, but they will not do it again once they know what hit them. So I think, but it would be, we have to stop being naive. I think there are too many things where, and it never used to matter, right? But now it does. For example, the whole financial system, SWIFT, And that transferring money internationally, even though that's actually based in Belgium, officially, technically, all the hardware is in the US. And any financial transaction in the world goes through the US, over and back. Even if it's from Belgium to the Netherlands, it goes through the US. The cables run that way, right? Well, it never used to matter. No one cared. It was, maybe they were cheaper or they were more efficient. Said, yeah, okay, you guys do that. But now you can't take that for granted. So we have to have whatever it takes in Europe so we can have financial transactions that are not dependent on the whims of an American regime.
Yeah, that brings us to the end of today's lunch lecture. Thank you again, Professor Lewandowski, and to all of you for being part of the discussion.